In one world, a German family huddles around a radio, learning of glorious victories while dividing their last potato. Their sons at the front subsist on watery soup. This is the reality of the Third Reich in 1944. In another world, just an ocean away, those same sons, now prisoners of war, stand in disbelief before trays laden with beef, butter, and fresh bread. This wasn't a battle of tanks or planes. It was a war of perception, and America's most potent secret weapon was something no one expected: its cafeteria. For the German Lanzer forged in the brutal crucible of the Eastern Front, survival was a grim calculus of calories. His world was one of hardtack biscuits that could break a tooth, thin soup flavored more by memory than substance, and the infamous ersatz coffee, a bitter brew of roasted acorns and barley that did little to fight off the bone-deep cold. He was conditioned by this scarcity, hardened by it. Propaganda posters back home showed a skeletal Uncle Sam, a nation supposedly crippled by decadence and internal strife, incapable of sustaining a prolonged war. His officers reinforced this daily. Capture by the Americans meant starvation, humiliation, and a cruel death. This was the narrative he carried in his bones, a certainty as solid as his Mauser rifle. Then came the shock of capture. Defeat was not a glorious ride into Valhalla, but a disorienting blur of surrender and processing. Herded onto ships, the men whispered among themselves, their fears stoked by the unknown. The long journey across the Atlantic was a descent into a void, each day stripping away the identity of the soldier and leaving only the prisoner. Arriving in America was another dislocation. Instead of the squalid barbed wire pits they had been promised, they were met with something unnervingly different: order, cleanliness, and an almost bureaucratic sense of efficiency. They were processed, given fresh clothes, and marched into camps that looked less like punishment centers and more like strangely Spartan towns. As the first group of newly arrived prisoners was marched toward a long wooden building, a murmur rippled through the ranks. The guards called it the mess hall. The Germans, accustomed to field kitchens and hurried meals in muddy trenches, translated the concept into their own experience. They joked grimly about the American cafeteria system, a word that sounded soft, civilian, and utterly unserious. It was a sign of the weakness they had been taught to expect. The laughter, however, caught in their throats as the doors swung open. It was the smell that hit them first. Not the familiar odor of boiling turnips and stale bread, but an impossible symphony of roasting meat, baking flour, and something else, the rich, dark aroma of real coffee. Inside there was no chaotic scrum, no ladling of gruel into dented tins. Instead, they saw long, clean tables and a serving line, behind which stood American soldiers, some of them African-American, a sight that in itself challenged the Reich's rigid racial doctrines, piling food onto metal trays with practiced ease. When it was their turn, the men moved as if in a trance. On their trays went a piece of meatloaf, a scoop of mashed potatoes with a dollop of butter melting on top, green beans, 2 thick slices of white bread, and a glass of milk. At the end of the line, a cook filled a heavy mug with steaming black coffee. It was a meal fit for a celebration. Yet here it was being served as a standard daily ration. This act of profound, almost casual abundance was more disorienting than any interrogation. It wasn't kindness, it was policy. The United States was a signatory to the Geneva Convention, which stipulated a simple, devastatingly effective rule. Prisoners of war were to be given the same rations as the base troops of their captors. The German POWs were eating the same meal as the American guards who watched over them. This was not a weapon of steel, but of psychology. As the men sat at the long tables, the silence was broken only by the sound of cutlery on trays. They ate slowly, deliberately, as if trying to understand the political and economic statement that each bite represented. This food was a symbol of a nation so incomprehensibly wealthy that it could afford to feed its enemies better than the Third Reich could feed its own fighting men. The first sip of real coffee was a revelation, a jolt that cleared away the fog of exhaustion and propaganda. In that moment, holding that warm mug, every story they had been told about a weak and crumbling America began to unravel. This was not the act of a desperate nation. It was the quiet, confident display of a superpower just beginning to show its true strength. The war, for these men, had just entered a new and deeply personal phase, fought not in the hedgerows of Normandy, but in the mess halls of America. The initial shock did not fade, it simply transformed into a new daily reality. The mess hall line became a silent classroom where the core tenets of Nazi ideology were dismantled, tray by tray. The mockery of the American cafeteria was replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. These German soldiers, who had been taught that they were members of a master race, now saw irrefutable proof of a system that was, by every tangible measure, superior in its ability to provide. They watched the American guards, who stood with their own trays eating the exact same food. There was no special officer's mess, no preferential treatment. This simple, egalitarian display struck at the heart of the rigid, hierarchical world they had always known. The propaganda had promised a nation divided by racial strife and class warfare, yet here were white and African American soldiers working side by side in the camp kitchens, united by a common, mundane task. The enemy, it turned out, was far more complex and far less monstrous than they had been led to believe. This education in American reality soon expanded beyond the barbed wire. As the war effort peaked and domestic labor shortages became acute, the United States began utilizing its vast pool of over 300,000 German prisoners. Under the Articles of the Geneva Convention, non-commissioned officers could volunteer for paid labor, and soon convoys of German POWs were heading out from the camps each morning to work on local farms, in canneries, and in lumber mills. For men who had spent years in the insulated, artificial world of the military, this was like stepping onto another planet. They were witnessing the American home front firsthand, and what they saw was the final, crushing blow to the lies they had been fed. They worked in fields groaning under the weight of their harvests, for farmers who drove their own automobiles and lived in homes with electricity and running water. They saw civilian grocery stores with shelves full of items that had been severely rationed or had disappeared entirely in Germany years earlier. They saw a nation not strained to its breaking point by war, but one that seemed to be fighting it with one hand, while its other hand continued to build, to produce, and to prosper with an almost effortless power. This first-hand observation reinforced the lesson of the mess hall 1,000 times over. The abundance wasn't a show put on for their benefit. It was the very fabric of American life. The experience humanized their captors in a way nothing else could. They shared lunches with the farmers' families, worked alongside American civilians, and learned scraps of English. They discovered a people who were not the goose-stepping militarists of their own society, nor the degenerate weaklings of their propaganda. They were simply people, defined by a powerful work ethic and an unshakable belief in their nation's resilience. When victory in Europe was declared in 1945 and the slow process of repatriation began, these men returned to a homeland that was a landscape of ash and ruin. They returned to starving families and shattered cities. And they carried with them a memory more powerful and lasting than any battle scar. The memory of a clean camp, fair treatment, and a cafeteria line that never ran short. For an entire generation of German men, their understanding of America was not forged in the fires of combat, but in the quiet, undeniable truth of a full meal. It was a strategic victory of logistics and humanity, proving that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a bomb, but a simple loaf of bread.